Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into the fascinating world of human history. Tonight, we are going to explore some of the most peculiar, mysterious, and downright strange beliefs that ancient cultures held dear. From the pyramids of Egypt to the temples of Cambodia, from the fjords of Scandinavia to the mountains of Peru, our ancestors developed intricate belief systems that might seem bizarre to us today, but made perfect sense within their cultural contexts. We'll journey through time to understand how these beliefs shaped entire civilizations, influenced daily life, and left lasting marks on human history that we can still see today. Some of these practices involved elaborate rituals. Others required tremendous sacrifices of time and resources, and many were passed down through generations with unwavering devotion. We'll discover how ancient peoples explained natural phenomena, communicated with their gods, and structured their entire societies around ideas that modern science has since replaced with different explanations. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Our exploration begins in ancient Egypt, a civilization that captivated the imagination of the world with its magnificent monuments and elaborate burial practices. The ancient Egyptians held a profound belief in the afterlife that governed virtually every aspect of their existence. They believed that death was merely a transition to another realm, and that proper preparation during life and after death was essential for ensuring a successful journey to the eternal paradise they called the Field of Reeds. This belief was so central to Egyptian culture that it influenced their architecture, art, medicine, and daily routines in ways that seem almost incomprehensible to modern minds. The process of mummification, which we often think of as simply preserving bodies, was actually a complex spiritual procedure that the Egyptians believed was necessary for the soul's survival in the afterlife. They thought that the soul consisted of several distinct parts, including the ka, which was a person's life force, and the ba, which was more like what we might call personality or individual essence. For these spiritual components to continue existing after physical death, the body had to be preserved in a very specific manner, following rituals that had been perfected over thousands of years. The mummification process itself was extraordinarily detailed and could take up to 70 days to complete. First, the internal organs were carefully removed and placed in special containers called canopic jars, each protected by a different god. The liver was guarded by Imseti, who had a human head, representing the protection of human essence. The lungs were protected by Hapi, depicted with a baboon head, symbolizing the breath of life that would be needed in the afterlife. The stomach found sanctuary with Duamutef, shown with a jackal head, ensuring proper nourishment in the eternal realm. Finally, the intestines were watched over by Kebesenuef, portrayed with a falcon head, representing the swift passage through the underworld. Each jar was not just a container, but a sacred vessel that required specific prayers and rituals during the organ placement ceremony. The brain was extracted through the nose using long metal hooks in a process that required incredible skill and patience. The embalmers would first break through the thin bone at the top of the nasal cavity, then carefully extract brain tissue piece by piece through the nostrils. This procedure could take several hours and required specialized tools that were passed down through generations of embalmers. Interestingly, the Egyptians didn't consider the brain particularly important and often discarded it entirely, sometimes filling the skull cavity with resin or linen to maintain the head's shape. This practice reveals their fundamental misunderstanding of where consciousness and personality originated, as they believed these qualities resided in the heart rather than the brain. The heart, however, was usually left in place because they believed it was the center of intelligence and emotion, and it would be needed in the afterlife for the weighing ceremony that determined a person's fate. If the heart was accidentally damaged or removed during the mummification process, embalmers would create a substitute heart from stone or other materials and place it in the chest cavity, often inscribing it with spells to ensure it would function properly during the judgment process. The heart was considered so crucial that many mummies were buried with heart amulets as additional protection, and the Book of the Dead contained specific spells designed to prevent the heart from bearing witness against the deceased during the weighing ceremony. The entire mummification industry employed thousands of people across Egypt, from the master embalmers who performed the most sacred procedures to the workers who gathered natron from desert deposits. Different levels of mummification were available depending on the family's wealth, with the most expensive process including gold leaf application, precious stone inlays, and elaborate wrapping patterns that could use hundreds of yards of the finest linen. The cheapest option involved simply drying the body in natron and wrapping it in coarse cloth. But even this basic treatment was considered essential for ensuring some chance of survival in the afterlife. Embalmers had to undergo years of training and were considered to hold one of the most important professions in Egyptian society. They were required to maintain ritual purity throughout their work, following strict dietary restrictions and ceremonial cleansing procedures. Many embalmers were also priests who could perform the religious ceremonies that accompanied the mummification process, making them essential intermediaries between the living and the dead. The workshops where mummification took place were considered sacred spaces, often located near temples or in specially designated areas outside cities, and were equipped with specialized tools, drainage systems, and storage facilities for the various materials required in the process. After the organs were removed, the body was packed with natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture that dried out all the moisture over the course of 40 days. This natron came from specific locations in the Egyptian desert where ancient lakes had evaporated, leaving behind crystalline deposits that the Egyptians recognized as having special preservative properties. The quality of natron could vary significantly depending on its source, with the finest grades reserved for royal mummifications and containing precise ratios of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. The body had to be completely buried in natron, requiring hundreds of pounds of the material for each mummification, making this one of the most expensive aspects of the entire process. During the 40-day natron treatment, The body would lose approximately 75% of its original weight as all moisture was drawn out of the tissues. Embalmers had to carefully monitor this process, occasionally repositioning the body and adding fresh natron to ensure even drying. The natron not only preserved the tissues, but also had antibacterial properties that prevented decay and eliminated odors. At the end of the drying period, the body would be completely desiccated, with skin that had turned dark and leathery but retained the person's general appearance and facial features. During this time, priests would perform daily rituals and recite prayers to ensure the deceased person's spiritual protection. These ceremonies weren't just performed at the embalming workshop, but also at temples throughout Egypt, creating a network of spiritual support for the deceased during their vulnerable transition period. Family members were expected to participate in these rituals, bringing offerings of food, flowers, and incense that would be presented to the gods on behalf of their loved one. The priests would also create protective amulets during this period, carefully crafting each one according to traditional designs and blessing them with specific spells. The prayers recited during mummification came from ancient collections of religious texts that had been refined over thousands of years of practice. Each prayer had a specific purpose, whether protecting the deceased from demons, ensuring safe passage through the underworld, or maintaining the connection between the soul and the preserved body. The priests had to memorize hundreds of these prayers and know exactly when and how to recite them during the mummification process. Some prayers were inscribed on papyrus and placed within the wrappings, while others were spoken aloud during specific procedures, and still others were carved into amulets that would accompany the mummy into the tomb. Once the drying process was complete, the body was cleaned and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen strips, with protective amulets placed between the layers. The linen used for wrapping had to meet strict quality standards and was often specially woven for mummification purposes. The finest linen came from flax grown in specific regions of Egypt and was processed using traditional methods that produced cloth of exceptional strength and purity. Different grades of linen were used for different parts of the body, with the finest material reserved for wrapping the head and hands, while coarser cloth might be used for initial body coverage. The wrapping process followed elaborate patterns that had been developed over centuries of practice. Each finger and toe was individually wrapped, then the hands and feet, followed by the arms and legs, and finally the torso and head. The wrapping had to be tight enough to maintain the body's shape, but not so tight as to damage the dried tissues. Between the layers of linen, embalmers would place hundreds of amulets, each positioned according to specific religious requirements. The most important amulets included the Jed pillar for stability, the Ankh for eternal life, the Eye of Horus for protection, and the scarab beetle for rebirth. Each wrap had to be applied in a specific pattern, while priests chanted appropriate spells from the Book of the Dead. The wrapping process alone could take 2 weeks to complete, with different specialists responsible for different aspects of the work. Master wrappers had trained for years to learn the proper techniques and could create intricate patterns that not only preserved the body, but also created a pleasing aesthetic appearance. The final wrapped mummy was often covered with a shroud decorated with religious scenes, and then placed in a series of nested coffins, each more elaborate than the last. The ancient Egyptians also believed that the deceased needed to bring material possessions into the afterlife, which explains why pharaohs were buried with golden treasures, furniture, food, and even entire boats. These weren't just symbols or offerings, but practical items that the dead person would actually use in their eternal existence. The selection of grave goods was a complex process that involved consulting religious texts, astronomical charts, and family traditions to determine exactly what each individual would need in the afterlife. Wealthy Egyptians might be buried with thousands of individual objects, each chosen for its specific function in the eternal realm. The boats found in Egyptian tombs weren't simply miniature models, but full-sized vessels that had been carefully disassembled and placed in specially constructed boat pits adjacent to the burial chambers. These boats were intended to carry the deceased across the celestial waters that separated the land of the living from the realm of the dead. The construction of these boats required master craftsmen who understood both shipbuilding techniques and religious requirements, as every aspect of the vessel had to conform to traditional designs that would be recognized and accepted by the gods of the underworld. Food offerings placed in tombs included not just preserved meats and grains, but also elaborate prepared dishes that represented the deceased person's favorite meals in life. Bakers and chefs were employed to create specific foods according to ancient recipes, and these offerings had to be renewed regularly by family members or hired priests. Some tombs contained complete kitchens with cooking utensils, storage jars, and serving vessels, along with magical texts that would ensure the food would never spoil and would continue to nourish the deceased throughout eternity. The golden treasures found in royal tombs represented not just wealth, but also spiritual power, as gold was considered the flesh of the gods and was believed to have protective and transformative properties. Each piece of jewelry, ornament, or decorative object was created according to traditional designs that incorporated specific religious symbols and was blessed by priests before being placed in the tomb. The craftsmanship required to create these objects was extraordinary, involving techniques that had been perfected over generations and required years of training to master. Furniture placed in tombs included beds, chairs, tables, and storage chests that were often more elaborate than anything the person had used in life. These pieces were constructed using the finest materials available and were decorated with religious scenes, protective symbols, and inscriptions that would help the deceased navigate the afterlife. Some furniture was specifically designed for use in the tomb and incorporated features that would be meaningful only in the context of death and rebirth, such as hidden compartments containing additional amulets or secret panels decorated with spells from the Book of the Dead. Servants were sometimes buried with their masters, not as human sacrifices in the brutal sense, but because the Egyptians genuinely believed these individuals would continue serving in the next world and would want to accompany their employers on the journey. However, this practice was relatively rare and was gradually replaced by the use of shabtis, small figurines that were magically animated to serve the deceased in the afterlife. These shabtis were often created in sets of hundreds or even thousands, with different figures assigned to perform specific tasks, such as farming, cooking, cleaning, or carrying messages between the deceased and the gods. The shabtis themselves were carefully crafted according to traditional designs and were inscribed with spells that would bring them to life when needed. Different materials were used for shabtis depending on the wealth and status of the deceased, ranging from simple clay figures for ordinary people to elaborate pieces carved from precious stones and metals for royalty. Each shabti was considered to have its own personality and capabilities, and sets of shabtis were often organized like miniature households or workshops, with supervisor figures overseeing groups of workers assigned to different tasks. Perhaps most fascinating was their belief in the judgment of the dead, a process they thought occurred in the Hall of Two Truths. According to Egyptian mythology, when a person died, their heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and justice. This ceremony was presided over by Osiris, the god of the underworld, and witnessed by 42 divine judges who would evaluate different aspects of the deceased person's moral character. Each judge was responsible for examining specific types of behavior, from major crimes like murder and theft to minor transgressions like gossiping or being disrespectful to parents. The weighing ceremony itself was conducted using a special balance scale that was maintained by Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and the dead. This scale was no ordinary measuring device, but was thought to be a cosmic instrument that could detect the true moral weight of a person's actions throughout their lifetime. The feather of Ma'at, which served as the standard of comparison, represented perfect truth and justice, and was said to be lighter than air, yet more substantial than mountains, embodying the paradoxical nature of moral purity. If the heart was lighter than the feather, meaning the person had lived a good and honest life, they would be allowed to enter the field of reeds, a paradise that was essentially an idealized version of Egypt, where the deceased could continue their earthly activities in perfect conditions. The field of reeds was described as having fertile soil that never needed irrigation, crops that grew without effort, and weather that was always perfect for any desired activity. The deceased would be reunited with family members who had died before them and could enjoy eternal youth and health while pursuing their favorite occupations and hobbies. If the heart was heavier, weighted down by sins and wrongdoing, it would be devoured by Emmet, a creature with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, resulting in the complete destruction of the person's soul. This wasn't simply punishment, but was considered a necessary cleansing that prevented corrupted souls from contaminating the afterlife realm. Emmet was not viewed as evil, but rather as a cosmic force of purification, removing those who had proven themselves unworthy of eternal existence. The Egyptians believed that there were ways to influence the outcome of this judgment, both through moral behavior during life and through magical protection after death. The negative confession, a list of sins that the deceased would deny having committed, was one of the most important elements of the judgment process. This confession included declarations such as, "I have not killed," "I have not stolen," "I have not told lies," and "I have not been angry without cause," covering virtually every aspect of moral behavior that the Egyptians considered important. However, the Egyptians also believed that simply reciting the negative confession was not enough. The deceased had to genuinely mean what they were saying, and their heart would reveal any deception during the weighing ceremony. This created a moral system where inner sincerity was just as important as outward compliance with social rules, encouraging people to develop genuine virtue rather than simply avoiding punishment. To help ensure a favorable judgment, Egyptians would often be buried with papyrus scrolls containing spells and instructions from the Book of the Dead. These weren't exactly religious texts in the way we might understand them today, but rather practical guidebooks for navigating the afterlife, complete with maps of the underworld, passwords for getting past various guardians, and incantations for transforming into different animals or objects if needed during the journey. The Book of the Dead was actually a collection of many different texts that had been compiled over centuries, with different versions containing different spells depending on the period when they were created and the specific needs of the person for whom they were prepared. Some spells in the Book of the Dead were designed to help the deceased remember their own name and identity, as the Egyptians believed that the trauma of death and the confusing nature of the underworld could cause amnesia that would make it impossible for the soul to function properly. Other spells provided instructions for navigating the complex geography of the afterlife, which was thought to include rivers that flowed backwards, doors that could only be opened by speaking the correct words, and paths that changed direction based on the traveler's moral status. The most elaborate versions of the Book of the Dead included detailed illustrations showing the various stages of the afterlife journey, the appearance of different gods and demons that would be encountered, and the proper postures and gestures required for different ceremonies. These illustrations weren't just decorative, but were thought to serve as magical tools that would help the deceased recognize important landmarks and beings in the afterlife, where everything would be strange and potentially dangerous. Moving across the Mediterranean, we encounter another civilization with equally fascinating beliefs, the ancient Greeks. While we often think of the Greeks as rational philosophers and mathematicians who laid the foundations for Western thought, they also held some remarkably strange ideas about the natural world and human nature that governed their daily lives in profound ways. The ancient Greeks believed that the four fundamental elements, earth, air, fire, and water, corresponded directly to four bodily fluids or humors that determined a person's personality, health, and fate. This theory wasn't just abstract philosophy, but was considered practical medical knowledge that could be used to diagnose and treat illness, predict behavior, and even determine career paths and marriage compatibility. The four humors were thought to exist in every person, but in different proportions, and these proportions could change based on factors like diet, exercise, climate, and emotional experiences. Blood was associated with air and made people sanguine, meaning cheerful and optimistic. Individuals with a predominance of blood were thought to be naturally sociable, confident, and prone to falling in love easily, but they could also be impulsive and unreliable. The ideal conditions for sanguine people included moderate temperatures and activities that involved social interaction and creative expression. Too much blood, however, could lead to excessive enthusiasm, reckless behavior, and a tendency to make promises that couldn't be kept. Phlegm corresponded to water and created phlegmatic individuals who were calm and unemotional. These people were considered to be naturally reliable, patient, and good at mediating disputes, but they could also be sluggish and resistant to change. Phlegmatic individuals were thought to thrive in cool, moist environments, and were often encouraged to pursue careers that required steady, careful work rather than rapid decision-making or emotional expression. An excess of phlegm was believed to cause apathy, depression, and a lack of motivation that could only be corrected through warming foods and stimulating activities. Yellow bile related to fire and produced choleric people who were hot-tempered and ambitious. Those with a choleric temperament were seen as natural leaders who could make quick decisions and take decisive action, but they were also prone to anger, impatience, and aggressive behavior. Choleric individuals were thought to perform best in warm, dry conditions and were often drawn to careers in military service, politics, or business. However, an excess of yellow bile was believed to cause rage, violence, and a tendency to make enemies through harsh or insensitive behavior. Black bile was linked to earth and resulted in melancholic personalities that were sad and thoughtful. Melancholic individuals were considered to be naturally introspective, artistic, and capable of deep intellectual pursuits, but they were also prone to depression, anxiety, and excessive worry. These people were thought to do well in cool, dry environments and were often encouraged to pursue careers in scholarship, art, or religious service. Too much black bile was believed to cause severe depression, paranoid thoughts, and a withdrawal from social interaction that could be dangerous to both the individual and society. This theory of humors wasn't just abstract philosophy, but had very real consequences for how Greeks lived their lives. They believed that illness occurred when these humors became unbalanced, and treatment involved adjusting diet, exercise, and lifestyle to restore proper proportions. Greek physicians developed elaborate diagnostic techniques to determine which humors were out of balance in their patients, examining everything from the color of urine and the texture of skin to the patient's dreams and emotional responses to different situations. Doctors would prescribe specific foods, activities, and even emotional states to rebalance a patient's humors. If someone was too melancholic, they might be advised to eat warm, moist foods like fresh fruits and vegetables, engage in cheerful activities like music and dancing, and avoid situations that might increase their natural tendency towards sadness and introspection. Choleric individuals might be given cooling foods like cucumbers and lettuce, encouraged to practice calming activities like meditation or gentle exercise, and warned against situations that might trigger their natural aggressiveness. The theory of humors also influenced Greek ideas about education and child-rearing, as parents and teachers were encouraged to observe children's natural temperaments and adjust their upbringing accordingly. A sanguine child might need more structure and discipline to counteract their natural impulsiveness, while a phlegmatic child might need encouragement and stimulation to overcome their natural passivity. Educational programs were often designed to help individuals understand their own temperament and learn how to manage their natural tendencies effectively. Greek marriage customs were also influenced by humoral theory, as families would consider temperamental compatibility when arranging marriages. The ideal marriage was thought to involve partners whose humors complemented each other, creating a balanced household where each person's strengths would compensate for their partner's weaknesses. A choleric husband might be paired with a phlegmatic wife who could calm his natural aggressiveness, while a melancholic woman might be married to a sanguine man who could lift her spirits and encourage her to be more socially active. The Greeks also held peculiar beliefs about the nature of vision and perception. Many ancient Greek philosophers, including some quite sophisticated thinkers, believed that the eyes didn't receive light from external objects, but rather projected rays outward that somehow touched or grasped the things being observed. This extramission theory of vision was supported by careful observation of certain phenomena, such as the way cats' eyes seem to glow in the dark, and the fact that people often seem to sense when they are being stared at, even when they cannot see the person looking at them. According to this theory, the process of seeing involved the eyes sending out invisible rays that traveled to distant objects and somehow brought information back to the observer. Different philosophers proposed different mechanisms for how this process worked. Some believed that the visual rays physically touched the objects being observed, while others thought that the rays created some kind of connection or communication between the observer and the observed object that allowed information to flow back to the eyes. This extramission theory of vision meant that seeing was considered an active process, where the eyes reached out to make contact with the world, rather than passively receiving reflected light as we now understand. The strength and range of these visual rays were thought to vary from person to person, explaining why some individuals had better eyesight than others, and why vision could be affected by factors like illness, fatigue, or strong emotions. Some people were believed to have particularly powerful visual rays that could affect the objects they looked at, leading to beliefs about the evil eye and the power of certain individuals to cause harm or good fortune through their gaze. This belief had interesting implications for how Greeks thought about beauty, art, and even social interactions. They believed that looking at something beautiful could literally bring some of that beauty back into the observer's soul through the visual rays, which is why they placed such emphasis on surrounding themselves with aesthetically pleasing objects and environments. Greek homes were decorated with beautiful pottery, sculptures, and paintings not just for display, but because the residents believed that daily exposure to these objects would gradually improve their own character and spiritual development. Conversely, they thought that looking at ugly or evil things could contaminate the observer, which influenced their ideas about appropriate subjects for art and literature. Greek artists and writers were encouraged to focus on themes of heroism, virtue, and beauty, while subjects involving crime, corruption, or physical deformity were often avoided or treated with great caution. This wasn't just aesthetic preference, but was based on the genuine belief that exposure to negative imagery could have harmful effects on both individuals and society as a whole. The extramission theory also influenced Greek ideas about education and child development. Teachers were warned to be careful about what they allowed their students to observe, as repeated exposure to inappropriate sights could permanently damage young minds. Educational environments were designed to be visually harmonious and uplifting, with careful attention paid to the arrangement of furniture, the selection of decorative objects, and even the clothing worn by instructors. Greek religious practices were also filled with behaviors that seem strange to modern sensibilities. They believed that their gods were incredibly petty and jealous beings who required constant attention and appeasement through elaborate rituals and sacrifices. Unlike many modern religions that emphasize moral behavior and spiritual development, Greek religious practice was largely transactional. You performed the correct ceremonies and made the proper offerings, and in return, the gods would grant your requests or at least refrain from punishing you. The Greek pantheon consisted of dozens of major and minor deities, each with their own personality, preferences, and areas of influence. Zeus was the king of the gods, but was also known for his violent temper and numerous affairs with mortal women. Hera, his wife, was perpetually jealous and vengeful toward Zeus's lovers and their children. Athena was wise and strategic, but could be ruthlessly violent when offended. Apollo was associated with music and poetry, but could also send plagues and death to those who displeased him. Greeks believed that these gods took active interest in human affairs and would intervene to help or harm mortals based on whether they felt properly honored and respected. This meant that religious observance was not just a matter of personal faith, but was considered essential for the safety and prosperity of entire communities. Cities would spend enormous resources on temple construction, religious festivals, and sacrifice offerings, viewing these expenditures as necessary investments in divine protection rather than optional expressions of piety. The sacrificial system that formed the core of Greek religious practice involved complex rules about which animals could be offered to which gods, how the sacrifices should be performed, and how the meat should be distributed afterward. Different gods preferred different types of animals. Zeus favored bulls, Athena preferred sheep, and Artemis liked deer or goats. The age, color, and physical condition of the sacrificial animal all had to meet specific requirements, and any deviation from the proper procedures could not only invalidate the offering, but could actually anger the gods and bring punishment upon the community. Greek religious festivals were elaborate community celebrations that could last for days and involved not just sacrifices, but also athletic competitions, dramatic performances, and communal feasting. These festivals served multiple purposes: honoring the gods, reinforcing social bonds within the community, and providing opportunities for artistic and athletic achievement. The most famous of these festivals was the Olympic Games, held every 4 years in honor of Zeus, which attracted competitors and spectators from across the Greek world, and was considered so important that wars would be temporarily suspended to allow safe travel to and from the games. The oracle at Delphi represents one of the most fascinating aspects of Greek religious belief. The ancient Greeks genuinely believed that a woman called the Pythia could enter into a trance-like state and deliver prophecies directly from the god Apollo. People would travel from across the Mediterranean world to ask questions about everything from personal relationships to major political decisions, and they would base their actions on the often cryptic and ambiguous answers they received. Modern scholars have proposed various theories about how the oracle actually worked, including the possibility that natural gas emissions from cracks in the earth beneath the temple might have induced hallucinogenic states in the Pythia. But for the ancient Greeks, there was no question that divine communication was taking place.
Major military campaigns were launched, colonies were founded, and marriages were arranged based on the oracle's pronouncements.
The influence of the Delphic oracle extended far beyond individual consultations to shape the political and cultural development of the entire Greek world. Cities would consult the oracle before establishing new settlements, and the god's approval was considered essential for the success of any major undertaking. The oracle also served as a kind of international mediator, with conflicting parties sometimes agreeing to accept Apollo's judgment in their disputes. This gave the oracle significant political influence, as the priests at Delphi could potentially affect the outcome of wars and diplomatic negotiations through their interpretation of the god's will. The temple complex became enormously wealthy from the fees charged for consultations and the valuable gifts offered by grateful petitioners, making it one of the most important economic and political centers in the ancient world. The decline of the oracle's influence came gradually as Greek culture was absorbed into the Roman Empire and new religious ideas began to replace traditional beliefs. The last recorded prophecy from the Delphic oracle occurred in the 4th century CE, marking the end of over 1,000 years of continuous operation. The temple complex was eventually abandoned and fell into ruins, though the site continued to be considered sacred by local populations for centuries afterward. Traveling further north, we encounter the Norse peoples of Scandinavia, who developed one of the most complex and violent mythological systems in human history. The Norse believed that the entire cosmos was structured as a great ash tree called Yggdrasil, with 9 different worlds hanging from its branches like fruit. This cosmic tree was not just a metaphor, but was thought to be a literal physical structure that could be traveled between by those who knew the proper techniques and had the god's permission. Each of the 9 worlds was inhabited by different types of beings with their own cultures, languages, and ways of life. Asgard was the realm of the Aesir gods, ruled by Odin and characterized by great halls where warriors feasted and prepared for the final battle. Midgard was the world of humans, connected to Asgard by the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, which could only be crossed by gods and the spirits of dead heroes. Jotunheim was the land of giants, who were locked in eternal conflict with the gods, but were also sometimes their allies, or even relatives through marriage. Alfheim housed the Light Elves, beings of great beauty and wisdom who were associated with fertility and prosperity. Svartalfheim was inhabited by dark elves or dwarves, master craftsmen who created magical weapons and treasures for gods and heroes. Vanaheim was the home of the Vanir, an older group of gods associated with fertility and prosperity who had been incorporated into the Norse pantheon through treaty and intermarriage with the Aesir. Helheim was the realm of the dead, ruled by the goddess Hel, where those who died of disease or old age would spend their afterlife. This was not necessarily a place of punishment, but simply the destination for ordinary deaths, as opposed to the glorious deaths in battle that would earn a warrior a place in Valhalla. Muspelheim was a realm of fire inhabited by fire giants and demons, while Niflheim was a world of ice and mist that existed from the beginning of time. These worlds were connected by the roots and branches of Yggdrasil, but travel between them was difficult and dangerous for ordinary mortals. The tree itself was tended by 3 sisters called the Norns, who watered its roots from the Well of Fate and controlled the destinies of all living beings. Various creatures lived in and around the tree, including a great eagle perched in its crown, a dragon that gnawed at its roots, and a squirrel that ran up and down the trunk carrying messages and insults between the eagle and the dragon. What made Norse beliefs particularly unique was their conviction that the universe was temporary and doomed to destruction. Unlike many religious systems that promise eternal paradise or cyclical renewal, the Norse believed in Ragnarok, a final apocalyptic battle that would result in the death of most gods and the destruction of the current world order. This event was not scheduled for some distant future, but was seen as an inevitable outcome that could occur at any time, making every day potentially the last day of the current cosmic cycle. The prophecy of Ragnarok described a series of signs that would herald the approaching end, including 3 years of continuous winter, the breaking of family bonds and social order, and the escape of various monsters and demons who had been imprisoned by the gods. The final battle would take place on a great plain called Vigrid, where the gods and their allies would face the forces of chaos in a conflict that would destroy both sides and consume the entire world in flames. This wasn't seen as a defeat or tragedy, but rather as a necessary and even glorious end that would pave the way for a new and better world to emerge from the ashes. The Norse believed that a few gods and humans would survive Ragnarok to populate the new world, which would be free from the conflicts and problems that had plagued the old one. This cyclical view of cosmic history gave the Norse a unique perspective on the meaning of life and death, where individual mortality was seen as part of a larger pattern of destruction and renewal. This belief in inevitable doom profoundly influenced Norse culture and values. Since they believed that courage in battle was the highest virtue and that warriors who died bravely would be taken to Valhalla to feast with the gods until Ragnarok, Norse society developed an almost obsessive focus on honor, bravery, and martial prowess. The concept of a good death was central to Norse thinking, with individuals striving to die in a manner that would bring glory to themselves and their families, while ensuring their place among the honored dead. They believed that a person's reputation and deeds were more important than their lifespan, leading to a culture that valued bold action over cautious survival. This philosophy influenced everything from personal relationships to political decisions, as individuals were expected to prioritize honor and courage, even when doing so might lead to death or disaster. The worst fate that could befall a Norse person was not death, but rather living in such a way that they would be forgotten or remembered with shame. The concept of wergild, or blood money, reflected Norse beliefs about justice and social order. Rather than relying primarily on formal legal systems, Norse communities often resolved conflicts through negotiated payments that would compensate victims or their families for losses suffered. However, these negotiations were complex affairs that involved not just material compensation, but also considerations of honor, reputation, and social status that could be just as important as monetary payments. Norse warrior culture included elaborate codes of conduct that governed behavior in battle, the treatment of enemies, and relationships between leaders and followers. These codes were not written laws, but rather traditional expectations that were passed down through oral tradition and reinforced through stories, poems, and social pressure. Breaking these codes could result in social exile or loss of honor that was considered worse than death. The Norse also had fascinating beliefs about the nature of fate and free will. They believed in three sisters called the Norns who spun the threads of destiny for every living being. But they also thought that individuals could influence their fate through their choices and actions. The eldest Norn, Erd, represented the past and wove the threads of what had already been accomplished. Verdandi embodied the present and determined what was currently happening. Skuld symbolized the future and influenced what was yet to come, though her work was less fixed than that of her sisters. This created an interesting tension where people were simultaneously bound by destiny and responsible for their own outcomes, leading to a cultural emphasis on accepting whatever happened while still striving to act with honor and courage. The Norse believed that while the major events of a person's life might be predetermined, the way they responded to these events was entirely under their own control and would determine their reputation and ultimate fate. The concept of word, or personal fate, was central to Norse thinking about individual responsibility and cosmic order. Each person was thought to have their own word that was shaped by their actions, the actions of their ancestors, and their relationships with other people.
This word was not just an individual matter, but was connected to the word of families, communities, and even entire peoples, creating a complex web of interconnected destinies that influenced each other in ways that were often difficult to predict or understand.
Norse funeral practices reflected their beliefs about the afterlife in dramatic ways. The most famous was ship burial, where important individuals would be placed in boats along with their possessions and either buried underground or set on fire and pushed out to sea. These ships were often large vessels that had been used during the person's lifetime and were equipped with everything the deceased might need for their journey to the afterlife, including weapons, tools, food, and sometimes even servants or animals. The ship burial ceremony was elaborate and could involve the entire community in its preparation and execution. The deceased would be dressed in their finest clothing and surrounded by objects that represented their achievements and status in life. Weapons were particularly important for male burials, as they were thought to be necessary for the continued battles that awaited warriors in the afterlife. Women might be buried with jewelry, household items, and tools related to their roles as managers of domestic affairs and practitioners of various crafts. The Norse believed that this would help the deceased travel to the afterlife, but the practice was also meant to demonstrate the person's wealth and status to both the living and the dead. The more elaborate the burial, the greater the honor shown to the deceased and their family, and the more likely it was that the person's memory would be preserved in the community's oral traditions. Some ship burials involved vessels that were over 90 feet long and required enormous amounts of labor and resources to prepare, making them statements of power and prestige that would be remembered for generations. They also practiced a form of divination called cider, which involved entering trance-like states to communicate with spirits and see the future. This practice was considered somewhat feminine in nature, and male practitioners were often viewed with suspicion or considered to be adopting inappropriate gender roles, but it was also highly valued as a way of gaining practical information about everything from weather patterns to enemy movements. Seder practitioners, usually called Velva or Seder women, would travel from community to community, providing prophecies, healing services, and magical assistance to those who could pay for their services. These women held significant social power despite the generally patriarchal nature of Norse society, as their abilities were considered essential for the well-being of individuals and communities. They were often consulted before major decisions, during times of crisis, and when communities needed to understand the will of the gods. The techniques involved in cider included chanting, drumming, and sometimes the use of herbs or other substances to alter consciousness. Practitioners would often work themselves into ecstatic states where they claimed to be able to see into other worlds, communicate with spirits of the dead, or perceive future events. These sessions could last for hours and were often attended by entire communities who would participate through singing, drumming, and ritual activities designed to support the Velva's work. The information obtained through cider was considered highly reliable and was used to make important decisions about everything from military campaigns to agricultural practices. The vulva might predict the outcome of battles, advise on the best times for planting and harvesting, identify the causes of illness or misfortune, or provide guidance about relationships and family matters. Their prophecies were often cryptic and required careful interpretation, similar to the oracles of other cultures, but they were generally treated with great respect and seriousness. Norse society also included a rich tradition of skaldic poetry, which served not just as entertainment, but as a form of historical record and magical practice. Skalds were professional poets who composed elaborate verses celebrating the deeds of heroes and rulers, and their work was considered to have the power to influence the reputation and fate of the people they wrote about. The most skilled skalds could literally create or destroy a person's social standing through their poetry, making them influential figures who were both feared and courted by the powerful. The Norse belief system also included complex ideas about the soul and consciousness that differed significantly from other cultures. They believed that each person possessed multiple spiritual components, including the huger, which was roughly equivalent to what we might call the mind or personality, and the hummer, which was a kind of spiritual essence that could sometimes separate from the physical body and travel independently. Some individuals were believed to have the ability to send their hammer to distant locations while their physical body remained in one place, allowing them to gather information, influence events, or communicate with other people across great distances. This practice, called hamferir, was considered a form of magic that required special training and was associated with both beneficial and harmful purposes. Skilled practitioners could spy on enemies, deliver messages, or provide assistance to allies. But the practice was also dangerous, as the hammer could become lost or damaged if the practitioner was not careful. Moving across the Atlantic, we find equally fascinating beliefs among the various indigenous cultures of the Americas. The Maya civilization developed one of the most sophisticated astronomical and mathematical systems in the ancient world. But they used this knowledge in service of beliefs that seem almost incomprehensibly complex to modern minds. The Maya believed that time moved in vast cycles, with the current world being just one in a series of previous worlds that had been created and destroyed by the gods. According to Maya mythology, there had been at least 3 previous worlds before the current one, each populated by different types of beings, and each destroyed when those beings failed to properly honor and serve the gods. The first world had been inhabited by beings made of mud, but they were destroyed because they could not speak properly or remember their creators. The second world was populated by beings made of wood, but they lacked souls and emotions and were destroyed by a great flood. The third world contained beings made of corn, but they were too perfect and could see too far into divine mysteries. So the gods clouded their vision and made them mortal. They calculated that the current world had begun on a specific date that corresponds to August 11, 3114 BCE in our calendar, and they developed incredibly precise astronomical observations to track the movement of celestial bodies through these great cycles of time. The Maya long count calendar was designed to track periods of time that extended far beyond human memory, including cycles that lasted over 5,000 years and supercycles that encompassed millions of years. This system required mathematical concepts that were remarkably advanced for their time, including the use of 0 as both a placeholder and an actual number, which allowed them to perform complex calculations involving very large numbers. Maya astronomers tracked the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars with extraordinary accuracy, creating tables that could predict eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and other celestial events hundreds of years in advance. They were particularly interested in Venus, which they called Noch Ek, the Great Star, and which they associated with warfare and political change. Maya rulers would often time military campaigns and other important political actions to coincide with specific phases of Venus's cycle, believing that the planet's position could influence the outcome of earthly events. The Maya developed sophisticated observatories and astronomical instruments that allowed them to make measurements that were accurate to within minutes of arc. Some of these observatories were elaborate stone structures with precisely aligned windows and openings that would frame specific celestial objects at important times of the year. Others were more subtle features built into temples and palaces that allowed priest astronomers to track celestial movements while conducting religious ceremonies. What made Maya beliefs so distinctive was their conviction that human actions could influence cosmic events, and that cosmic events directly affected human affairs. They believed that the gods required regular nourishment in the form of human blood, and that various rituals involving bloodletting were necessary to maintain the proper functioning of the universe. This wasn't just symbolic, but was thought to be literally necessary. Without human participation in these rituals, the sun might fail to rise, the rains might not come, and the entire cosmic order could collapse. The Maya understanding of blood sacrifice was based on their creation mythology, which described how the gods had shed their own blood to create the current world and its inhabitants. Humans were therefore obligated to reciprocate by offering their own blood back to the gods, maintaining the cosmic cycle of creation and destruction that kept the universe functioning. Different types of blood offerings were appropriate for different purposes, with the blood of rulers being considered the most powerful because of their divine connections. Maya rulers were expected to perform elaborate bloodletting ceremonies at regular intervals, often piercing their tongues, earlobes, or other body parts with obsidian blades or stingray spines. The choice of body part and the specific method of bloodletting were determined by astronomical calculations and the particular gods being honored. Tongue piercing was often associated with communication and prophecy, as the tongue was considered the organ of speech and therefore connected to divine wisdom. Ear piercing was linked to hearing and understanding divine messages, while genital bloodletting was associated with fertility and continuation of royal lineages. The blood would be collected on special paper made from bark, which would then be burned so that the smoke could carry the offering up to the gods. This paper, called hoon, was made from the inner bark of fig trees and was prepared according to ancient techniques that had been perfected over centuries. The preparation of hoon was itself a sacred process that involved specific prayers and rituals, and different qualities of paper were used for different types of ceremonies. The finest hoon was reserved for royal bloodletting ceremonies and was sometimes decorated with sacred symbols or scenes from Maya mythology. These ceremonies were often timed to coincide with astronomical events like eclipses or the appearances of certain planets, reinforcing the connection between earthly actions and cosmic phenomena. Eclipse ceremonies were particularly important because the Maya believed that eclipses occurred when celestial jaguars attempted to devour the sun or moon, and human blood offerings were necessary to strengthen these celestial bodies and help them escape from their attackers. The timing of these ceremonies had to be extremely precise, as the effectiveness of the ritual was thought to depend on performing it at exactly the right moment in the astronomical cycle. The Maya also believed that certain individuals could transform into animal spirits or travel to other worlds through shamanic practices. These beliefs were closely tied to their understanding of caves, which they saw as entrances to the underworld and as sacred spaces where communication with supernatural beings was possible. Cave systems throughout the Maya region were used as temples and ceremonial centers, with elaborate rituals conducted in underground chambers that could be reached only after hours of difficult travel through narrow passages and dangerous terrain. Archaeological evidence shows that Maya people regularly conducted ceremonies deep underground, sometimes traveling for miles through cave systems to reach particular chambers where they would leave offerings and perform rituals. These underground ceremonies often involved the deposition of precious objects like jade ornaments, obsidian blades, and ceramic vessels decorated with scenes from Maya mythology. Some caves contain evidence of bloodletting ceremonies performed hundreds of feet below ground, where the smoke from burning blood-soaked paper would have had no way to reach the surface, and therefore must have been intended to communicate directly with underworld deities. The Maya believed that caves were living entities with their own personalities and powers, and that different caves were associated with different types of supernatural beings and ceremonial purposes. Some caves were considered to be the homes of rain gods and were used for ceremonies designed to ensure adequate rainfall for agricultural purposes. Others were thought to be entrances to the realm of the ancestors and were used for rituals involving communication with the spirits of deceased rulers and other important figures. Cave ceremonies often involved the use of hallucinogenic substances and other techniques designed to induce altered states of consciousness that would allow participants to perceive and interact with supernatural beings. Maya shamans would consume preparations made from various plants, including certain types of mushrooms, flowering vines, and tree barks that contained psychoactive compounds. These substances were not used casually, but were considered sacred tools that required extensive preparation and purification before use. Their calendar system reflected their complex understanding of time as both linear and cyclical. They simultaneously tracked multiple different calendar cycles, including a 260-day sacred calendar called the Tzolk'in, a 365-day solar calendar called the Hab, and much longer cycles that lasted thousands of years. The interaction between these different calendar systems created a complex web of temporal relationships that the Maya used to determine the most auspicious times for various activities. The Tzolk'in was based on the interaction between a cycle of 20 day names and a cycle of 13 numbers, creating 260 unique day combinations. Each day in this calendar was associated with specific gods, animals, colors, and directional orientations that influenced the types of activities that should be performed and the kinds of ceremonies that should be conducted. Maya people would consult the Tzolk'in calendar before making important decisions, planning ceremonies, or undertaking significant projects. The Hab calendar was more closely aligned with the agricultural cycle and was based on 18 months of 20 days each, plus a short period of 5 days that were considered unlucky and dangerous. The Maya understood that this calendar was slightly shorter than the actual solar year and developed correction mechanisms to keep it synchronized with the seasons over long periods of time. Different months in the Hab were associated with different agricultural activities, religious festivals, and social obligations. They believed that the intersection of these various cycles created moments of special power or danger when the normal rules of reality might be suspended and supernatural events could occur. The most important of these intersections occurred when significant points in multiple calendar cycles coincided, creating what the Maya called period endings that were marked by elaborate ceremonies and often by the construction of new monuments or buildings. Maya mathematics was intimately connected to their religious and astronomical beliefs, with numbers themselves considered to have spiritual significance and power. The Maya used a vigesimal, base 20 number system and developed the concept of zero independently of other civilizations, allowing them to perform complex calculations involving very large numbers. They represented numbers using a combination of dots representing units and bars representing fives, which could be combined to represent any number from 0 to 19. For larger numbers, the Maya used a positional notation system similar to our decimal system, but based on multiples of 20 rather than 10. This system allowed them to write numbers in the millions and to perform calculations involving astronomical periods that extended over thousands of years. Maya mathematicians developed techniques for solving complex problems involving calendar calculations, astronomical predictions, and architectural measurements that required sophisticated understanding of mathematical relationships. Maya writing was one of the most advanced systems developed in the ancient Americas, consisting of hundreds of glyphs that could represent sounds, syllables, or entire concepts. The development of Maya writing was closely connected to their religious and astronomical interests, as much of the earliest writing was used to record information about calendar dates, astronomical observations, and religious ceremonies. Maya scribes were highly trained specialists who underwent years of education to learn the complex rules governing the use of different glyphs and the proper methods for combining them to express complex ideas. Maya books, called codices, were made from bark paper and contained information about astronomy, mathematics, religious ceremonies, and historical events. Unfortunately, most Maya codices were destroyed during the Spanish conquest, with only a few surviving examples providing insight into the full scope of Maya knowledge and beliefs. The surviving codices reveal the sophistication of Maya intellectual achievement and suggest that their libraries once contained vast amounts of information about subjects ranging from medicine and agriculture to philosophy and literature. In South America, the Inca civilization developed beliefs that were equally complex, but focused more on the physical landscape and the relationships between humans, ancestors, and the natural world. The Inca believed that certain geographical features, mountains, rocks, springs, and other landmarks were actually living beings with their own personalities, preferences, and powers. These features, called huacas, were thought to be ancestors or gods who had transformed themselves into permanent forms to watch over their descendants. The Inca practiced a form of ancestor veneration that involved preserving the bodies of deceased rulers and bringing them out for special ceremonies. These mummies weren't just symbols or memorials, but were thought to be the actual living presence of the former kings, who could still give advice, make decisions, and participate in political affairs. Each royal mummy had its own household, with servants who would tend to its needs, prepare its food, and report on current events as if the dead king were still alive and actively ruling. This belief in the continued presence of ancestors extended throughout Inca society, not just to royalty. Families would preserve the remains of important relatives and consult them for guidance on important decisions. They believed that the dead continued to play active roles in the lives of their descendants, and that maintaining proper relationships with ancestors was essential for success and prosperity in this world. The Inca also developed a complex system of reciprocity that governed not just human relationships, but also interactions with the natural world and supernatural beings. They believed that every action created obligations and that balance had to be maintained through appropriate responses. If you took something from nature, you had to give something back. If the gods provided good weather for your crops, you owed them offerings and ceremonies in return. This principle of reciprocity influenced their political and economic systems in fascinating ways. The Inca emperor was thought to be directly descended from the sun god, but this divine status came with enormous responsibilities. He was expected to ensure the prosperity of his people through his personal relationship with the gods, and if crops failed or disasters occurred, it was seen as evidence that he had failed in his obligations to maintain proper cosmic balance. Across the Pacific, in ancient China, we encounter belief systems that were more philosophical than religious in the traditional sense, but which nonetheless governed daily life in extremely detailed ways. The ancient Chinese developed the concept of qi, a form of life energy that they believed flowed through all living things and could be manipulated through various practices to improve health, longevity, and spiritual development. The Chinese believed that qi moved through the human body along specific pathways called meridians, and that illness occurred when this flow was blocked or unbalanced. This led to the development of acupuncture, a medical practice that involves inserting thin needles at specific points along these meridians to restore proper qi flow. What's remarkable is that this system was based entirely on theoretical understanding of energy flows that couldn't be directly observed or measured, yet it produced practical medical techniques that many people found effective. Chinese beliefs about qi extended far beyond medicine to influence architecture, agriculture, and even political organization. The practice of feng shui involves arranging physical spaces to optimize the flow of qi based on complex calculations involving geographical features, compass directions, and the positions of various objects. Ancient Chinese cities were laid out according to feng shui principles, with the emperor's palace positioned to take advantage of favorable qi flows and important buildings oriented to harmonize with cosmic forces. The Chinese also developed elaborate theories about the relationship between human affairs and natural phenomena. They believed that the emperor ruled by the mandate of heaven, which could be withdrawn if he failed to maintain proper harmony between earth and sky. Natural disasters like floods, earthquakes, or eclipses were interpreted as signs that the current dynasty had lost divine approval and could legitimately be overthrown. This belief in the connection between natural events and political legitimacy had profound practical consequences. Chinese history is filled with examples of dynasties that fell shortly after major natural disasters, not necessarily because the disasters themselves weakened their military power, but because people interpreted these events as proof that the rulers had lost the right to govern. Ancient Chinese beliefs about time and change were also distinctive. Rather than seeing history as linear progress or cyclical repetition, they developed the concept of the I Ching, or Book of Changes, which described reality as constantly shifting patterns of yin and yang forces. This understanding was based on careful observation of natural phenomena and the recognition that all things contain within themselves the seeds of their own transformation. The I Ching was not just a philosophical text, but was used as a practical tool for making decisions and understanding current situations. The system was based on 64 hexagrams, each consisting of 6 lines that could be either solid, yang, or broken, yin. These hexagrams were thought to represent all possible combinations of cosmic forces and could be consulted through various divination methods to gain insight into the likely development of particular situations. The use of the I Ching required extensive study and practice, as each hexagram had multiple layers of meaning that could be interpreted in different ways depending on the specific question being asked and the circumstances of the person consulting it. Skilled practitioners developed intuitive understanding of the relationships between different hexagrams and could provide guidance that took into account both the immediate situation and longer-term patterns of change. They believed that by understanding these patterns, it was possible to predict future developments and make decisions that would harmonize with natural trends rather than opposing them. This created a decision-making philosophy that emphasized working with natural forces rather than attempting to control or dominate them, and that valued flexibility and adaptation over rigid adherence to predetermined plans. Chinese medicine was based on similar principles, with physicians understanding illness as the result of imbalances or disruptions in the natural flow of qi through the body. Treatment involved not just addressing immediate symptoms, but understanding the underlying patterns of energy flow that had led to the problem, and working to restore natural harmony and balance. This approach required practitioners to consider not just physical symptoms, but also emotional states, lifestyle factors, and environmental influences that might be affecting the patient's overall energy patterns. The development of traditional Chinese medicine involved centuries of careful observation and clinical experience, with practitioners documenting the effects of different treatments and gradually developing more sophisticated understanding of how various interventions affected the flow of qi. Different schools of Chinese medicine developed different approaches to diagnosis and treatment, but all were based on the fundamental understanding that health depended on maintaining proper balance and flow of life energy. Chinese dietary therapy was closely integrated with medical practice, with different foods understood to have specific effects on qi flow and overall health. Practitioners would prescribe particular combinations of foods, not just for their nutritional content, but for their energetic properties and their ability to support or correct specific patterns of qi flow. The preparation and consumption of food was considered to have significant effects on health and spiritual development, leading to elaborate culinary traditions that emphasized both taste and therapeutic value. In ancient India, the development of Hindu and Buddhist belief systems introduced concepts that were radically different from anything we've discussed so far. The idea of karma, that actions in this life would determine circumstances in future lives, created an understanding of individual responsibility that extended across multiple lifetimes and influenced every aspect of daily behavior. Ancient Indians believed that the soul was eternal and would be reborn repeatedly until it achieved liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. This wasn't just a philosophical concept, but had practical implications for how people understood social relationships, moral obligations, and personal goals. The concept of reincarnation was based on careful observation of the apparent inequalities and injustices in human life, with the understanding that current circumstances could only be explained by actions in previous lifetimes. If your current circumstances were the result of actions in previous lives, then accepting your situation while working to improve your karma for the future became a central life strategy. This created a moral system that emphasized personal responsibility while also providing explanations for otherwise inexplicable suffering or good fortune.
The law of karma was understood to operate with mathematical precision, ensuring that every action would eventually produce appropriate consequences, even if those consequences might not appear until future lifetimes.
The caste system that developed in ancient India was deeply connected to these beliefs about karma and reincarnation. Different social groups were thought to represent different levels of spiritual development, with individuals being born into appropriate castes based on their actions in previous lives. This created a social structure that was seen as both natural and just, since everyone's position was understood to be the result of their own past choices rather than arbitrary social conventions or economic exploitation. The four main castes were understood to represent different approaches to spiritual development and different types of karma that individuals needed to work through in their spiritual evolution. The Brahmins, or priestly caste, were thought to be souls that had achieved high levels of spiritual development and were focused on religious and intellectual pursuits. The Kshatriyas, or warrior caste, were souls that needed to work through karma related to power, leadership, and the use of force. The Vaishyas, or merchant caste, were focused on economic activities and the karma associated with material prosperity. The Shudras, or service caste, were working through karma related to service to others and the development of humility. Each caste had its own dharma, or righteous duty, that determined appropriate behavior and occupation for its members. Following one's dharma was considered essential for spiritual progress, as it provided the most effective way to work through the particular types of karma that had led to birth in that caste. Attempting to perform the dharma of a different caste was thought to be spiritually counterproductive and could actually slow down one's progress toward eventual liberation. Ancient Indian practices like yoga and meditation were developed as practical techniques for spiritual advancement based on beliefs about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical body. Early practitioners believed that through specific physical postures, breathing techniques, and mental exercises, it was possible to directly experience higher states of consciousness and eventually achieve permanent liberation from the cycle of rebirth. The development of yoga involved centuries of experimentation with different techniques for controlling and refining consciousness. Different schools developed different approaches, but all were based on the understanding that ordinary consciousness was limited and distorted by attachment to material concerns, and that through proper practice, it was possible to achieve states of awareness that provided direct insight into the true nature of reality. The physical practices of yoga were understood to be preparations for more advanced mental and spiritual practices. By developing control over the physical body and the breath, practitioners could create the stability and concentration necessary for deeper forms of meditation. The various postures and movements were not just exercises, but were designed to create specific effects on the flow of subtle energy through the body, and to prepare consciousness for experiences that transcended ordinary physical awareness. Meditation practices were based on the understanding that the mind naturally tends to become absorbed in external concerns and emotional reactions, preventing direct experience of deeper levels of consciousness. Through systematic training in concentration and mindfulness, practitioners could learn to observe their own mental processes without becoming identified with them, eventually achieving states of pure awareness that were free from the limitations of ordinary thinking. The concept of dharma, righteous duty or natural law, provided another organizing principle for ancient Indian society. People believed that each individual had specific obligations based on their caste, life stage, and circumstances, and that fulfilling these duties was essential for spiritual progress. This created a complex ethical system where right and wrong were determined not by universal principles, but by each person's particular situation and role in society. The Dharma system included detailed prescriptions for behavior that covered virtually every aspect of daily life, from dietary restrictions and marriage customs to occupational duties and religious observances. These prescriptions were not seen as arbitrary rules, but as natural laws that reflected the cosmic order and provided the most effective path for spiritual development. Following Dharma was understood to create positive karma that would lead to better circumstances in future lives, while violating Dharmic principles would create negative karma that would result in suffering and spiritual regression. Ancient Indian astronomy and mathematics developed within this spiritual framework, with mathematical concepts like zero and infinity being understood as reflections of deeper truths about the nature of reality. The elaborate calculations used to determine auspicious times for ceremonies and important events were based on beliefs about the influence of celestial bodies on human affairs, but they also produced sophisticated mathematical techniques that had practical applications beyond religious contexts. The development of Indian mathematics was closely connected to astronomical observations and astrological calculations. Ancient Indian astronomers developed highly accurate methods for predicting eclipses, planetary positions, and other celestial events, and they used this knowledge to create detailed calendars that specified the most favorable times for various activities. The mathematical techniques required for these calculations led to innovations in algebra, trigonometry, and number theory that were far in advance of developments in other parts of the world. The concept of infinity was particularly important in Indian mathematics and philosophy, as it provided a way of understanding the eternal nature of the soul and the endless cycles of rebirth and liberation. Indian mathematicians developed sophisticated techniques for working with infinite series and infinitesimal quantities, laying the groundwork for concepts that would later become central to calculus and other advanced mathematical disciplines. Moving to the ancient cultures of Africa, we find belief systems that were often closely tied to specific geographical locations and natural phenomena. Many African cultures developed complex relationships with animal spirits, believing that certain animals could serve as intermediaries between the human world and the realm of ancestors and gods. The ancient kingdom of Kush, located in what is now Sudan, believed that their pharaohs were chosen by the god Amun through a process of divine selection that involved elaborate ceremonies at specific temples. Unlike their Egyptian neighbors, who traced royal legitimacy through family lineage, the Kushites believed that divine approval could be given to anyone who demonstrated the proper spiritual qualifications, leading to a more fluid system of political succession. Kushite burial practices included placing the pharaoh's horses and sometimes other animals in chambers near the royal tomb, based on beliefs that these animals would serve as transportation and companions in the afterlife. This wasn't simply copying Egyptian practices, but reflected distinctly Kushite beliefs about the relationships between humans, animals, and the supernatural world. Many West African cultures developed beliefs about the power of spoken words to shape reality directly. They thought that certain individuals, particularly griots or traditional storytellers, possessed the ability to influence events through their speech, making the role of oral historian not just a matter of preserving information, but of actively participating in the ongoing creation of the world. These beliefs about the power of language led to elaborate praise-singing traditions where specific words and phrases were thought to literally strengthen warriors before battle or bring prosperity to communities. The griots weren't just entertainers, but were considered essential participants in important ceremonies and political events because their words could help determine outcomes. Ancient African metallurgy was often surrounded by beliefs about the spiritual properties of different metals and the magical powers of blacksmiths.
Ironworking was considered a sacred craft in many cultures, with blacksmiths serving as intermediaries between the human world and the realm of spirits.
The transformation of raw ore into useful tools and weapons was seen as a form of alchemy that required not just technical skill, but spiritual power. In ancient Mesopotamia, the world's first urban civilization developed belief systems that influenced virtually every subsequent culture in the region. The Babylonians created detailed maps of the heavens and developed sophisticated mathematical techniques for predicting the movements of planets and stars. But they used this knowledge primarily for astrological purposes, believing that celestial events directly controlled human affairs. Babylonian astrology wasn't the simplified horoscope system that many people know today, but was an incredibly complex discipline that required years of study to master. Practitioners had to memorize thousands of celestial omens and learn to interpret combinations of astronomical events, weather patterns, and earthly occurrences to provide guidance for everything from personal decisions to state policy. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest surviving works of literature, reflects Mesopotamian beliefs about the relationship between humans and gods, the nature of friendship and loyalty, and the inevitability of death. The story's hero seeks immortality, but ultimately learns to accept mortality, while striving to achieve lasting fame through great deeds, reflecting cultural values that emphasized accepting limitations while still pursuing excellence. Mesopotamian religious practices included elaborate temple complexes where priests performed daily rituals to care for statues of gods, treating these images as if they were living beings who needed food, clothing, and entertainment. The gods were thought to actually inhabit their statues, making the proper maintenance of temples essential for maintaining divine favor and protection for the entire community. Ancient Persian Zoroastrianism introduced revolutionary concepts that would later influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The idea of a cosmic struggle between good and evil forces, with humans having the free will to choose sides and influence the ultimate outcome, created a very different understanding of moral responsibility and divine justice compared to earlier belief systems. Zoroastrians believed that after death, souls would be judged based on their lifetime balance of good and evil thoughts, words, and deeds. This judgment would determine whether they spent eternity in paradise or torment, but it also included the revolutionary idea that eventually all souls would be purified and the entire cosmos would be restored to perfect goodness, making temporary punishment a form of spiritual education rather than permanent damnation. The Zoroastrian emphasis on personal moral choice and the ultimate triumph of good over evil provided a framework for understanding individual responsibility that was quite different from systems that emphasized fate, karma, or divine whim. This created a culture that valued ethical behavior for its own sake rather than just as a means of avoiding punishment or gaining rewards. The Zoroastrian ethical system was based on the threefold path of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, with believers expected to actively choose righteousness in all aspects of their lives. The Zoroastrian understanding of free will was sophisticated and nuanced, recognizing that while individuals had the power to choose between good and evil, these choices were influenced by education, social environment, and spiritual development. The religion emphasized the importance of proper education and moral guidance in helping people make good choices, and included detailed ethical teachings that covered virtually every aspect of daily life. Zoroastrian fire worship was based on beliefs about the sacred nature of light and its connection to divine truth and purity. Fire was not worshipped as a god, but was revered as a symbol and manifestation of Ahura Mazda's light that could help believers focus their devotion and purify their thoughts and intentions. Sacred fires were maintained in special temples and were tended by trained priests who followed elaborate rituals to ensure the flames remained pure and uncontaminated. Different grades of sacred fire were maintained for different purposes, with the most sacred fires requiring decades of ritual purification before they could be established. These fires were fed only with specific types of fuel that had been blessed and purified according to traditional procedures, and the priests who tended them had to maintain strict standards of ritual purity through careful attention to their diet, clothing, and personal conduct. In ancient Japan, Shinto beliefs created a unique understanding of the relationship between humans, nature, and the spirit world. The Japanese believed that kami, or spirits, inhabited virtually everything in the natural world, from mountains and rivers to trees and rocks. This wasn't animism in the sense of thinking that inanimate objects were alive, but rather a recognition that spiritual forces were present throughout the physical world and could be communicated with through proper rituals and attitudes. The concept of kami was complex and multifaceted, encompassing everything from the spirits of deceased ancestors to the divine forces that animated natural phenomena. Some kami were considered to be powerful deities who could influence major events and natural processes, while others were more localized spirits associated with particular places, objects, or activities. The relationship between humans and kami was understood to be reciprocal, with proper respect and offerings from humans resulting in protection and assistance from the spirit world. Shinto practices involved elaborate purification ceremonies designed to maintain harmony between the human community and the spirit world. These weren't just symbolic acts, but were thought to have real effects on both spiritual and physical well-being. The emphasis on cleanliness and purity that became central to Japanese culture developed from these ancient beliefs about the importance of maintaining proper relationships with kami. The purification ceremonies included both physical cleansing with water and spiritual purification through prayer, offerings, and ritual activities. Different types of impurity required different types of purification, with some contamination being relatively minor and easily corrected, while other forms of spiritual pollution required extensive rituals and might result in temporary exclusion from certain activities or locations. Japanese beliefs about the divine nature of the emperor created a political system where secular and religious authority were completely intertwined. The emperor was thought to be descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, making political loyalty a form of religious devotion and creating a system of government that was unlike anything that developed in other parts of the world. This divine connection was not just theoretical, but was believed to give the emperor actual supernatural powers and responsibilities. The imperial role included serving as the chief priest of the Shinto religion, with the emperor expected to perform specific rituals that were considered essential for the well-being of the nation. These ceremonies were not just formal observances, but were believed to have real effects on everything from agricultural fertility to military success to natural disaster prevention. The emperor's spiritual duties were considered just as important as his political responsibilities, and failure to properly perform ritual obligations could potentially bring disaster upon the entire country. Ancient Celtic cultures across Europe developed beliefs that emphasized the sacred nature of certain landscapes, particularly groves of trees, springs, and hills that were thought to be dwelling places of gods and spirits. These beliefs led to religious practices that were conducted outdoors rather than in built temples, creating a form of spirituality that was intimately connected to specific geographical locations and natural phenomena. Celtic sacred sites were often located in places where natural features created particularly striking or unusual landscapes, such as hilltops with commanding views, springs with unusual mineral content, or groves of trees with particularly impressive size or longevity. These locations were believed to be places where the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was thin, making communication with divine forces more possible and effective. Celtic druids served as priests, judges, teachers, and healers, roles that required decades of training and memorizing vast amounts of oral tradition. They believed that writing down sacred knowledge would diminish its power, so the most important religious and legal information was preserved only in the memories of specially trained individuals. This created a system where spiritual and secular authority was concentrated in a small group of highly educated specialists who served as the repositories of cultural knowledge and wisdom. The training required to become a druid was extensive and could take 20 years or more to complete. Candidates had to memorize enormous amounts of information, including religious lore, legal precedents, historical accounts, genealogies, and various forms of specialized knowledge related to astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. The Druids also had to develop practical skills in areas such as divination, healing, and ritual performance that required not just theoretical knowledge, but also personal spiritual development and practical experience. Celtic beliefs about the afterlife included the concept of the otherworld, a parallel realm that existed alongside the normal world, and could be accessed through certain locations or at specific times of year. This wasn't exactly heaven or hell, but rather an alternative reality where different rules applied and where the spirits of the dead could interact with the living. The otherworld was described as a place of eternal youth and beauty, where pain, sorrow, and death were unknown. But it was also a place where time moved differently, and where visitors could become lost or trapped if they were not careful. The entrances to the otherworld were thought to be located in specific geographical features, such as caves, springs, stone circles, and burial mounds. But they were also believed to open at certain times of year when the boundary between worlds became permeable. The Celtic festival of Samhain, which later became Halloween, was considered to be the most important of these times when communication between the living and the dead was possible, and when spirits could cross freely between worlds. The ancient Aztec civilization in Mexico developed one of the most complex and demanding religious systems in human history, based on beliefs about the constant struggle required to maintain cosmic balance. The Aztecs believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the current world, and that humans owed a corresponding debt that could only be repaid through elaborate ceremonies and offerings. The Aztec creation mythology described how the current world, called the fifth sun, had been created through the sacrifice of the gods who threw themselves into a great fire to become the sun and moon. This act of divine self-sacrifice established the principle that blood offerings were necessary to maintain the functioning of the universe, and that humans were obligated to provide these offerings to ensure the continued existence of the world. Aztec religious practices required enormous investments of time, resources, and human energy, with constant festivals, ceremonies, and rituals that involved the entire population. These weren't just social events, but were thought to be essential for maintaining the proper functioning of the universe. The failure to perform these ceremonies correctly could result in cosmic catastrophe, making religious observance a matter of survival for the entire civilization. The Aztec calendar included over 100 different festivals and ceremonies throughout the year, each designed to honor specific gods and maintain particular aspects of cosmic harmony. Some of these ceremonies were relatively simple affairs that could be conducted by individual families or local communities, while others were massive public spectacles that involved thousands of participants and required months of preparation. The most important Aztec ceremonies involved human sacrifice, which was understood not as cruel violence, but as the highest form of religious offering that could be made to the gods. The Aztecs believed that human life force was the most precious gift that could be offered. and that the sacrifice of human beings was necessary to provide the energy required to keep the sun moving across the sky and to maintain the fertility of the earth. The Aztec understanding of time as cyclical and their beliefs about the eventual destruction and renewal of the world created a culture that was simultaneously fatalistic and incredibly energetic. They believed that the current world was doomed to end in earthquakes and destruction, but they also thought that human actions could delay this fate and ensure that when the world did end, it would be reborn in proper form. This cyclical view of cosmic history was reflected in Aztec art, architecture, and literature, which often depicted themes of death and rebirth, destruction and renewal. The Aztecs understood themselves to be living in the final age of the current world cycle, which gave urgency to their religious practices and created a culture that valued heroic action and dramatic gesture over long-term planning and gradual development. Aztec education systems were designed to train young people not just in practical skills, but in the proper performance of religious duties, with different schools for different social classes, but all emphasizing the importance of understanding one's role in maintaining cosmic harmony. This created a society where religious knowledge was considered just as important as technical expertise for successful functioning in any profession. The Kalmakak schools that educated the children of nobles included extensive training in astronomy, mathematics, writing, and religious ritual, preparing students for roles as priests, government officials, and military leaders. The Telpochkali schools that served commoner children focused more on practical skills and basic religious knowledge, but still included significant education in the ceremonial obligations that all citizens were expected to fulfill. As we near the end of our journey through these ancient belief systems, it's worth reflecting on what these various cultures had in common despite their obvious differences. Almost all of them developed complex explanations for natural phenomena that we now understand through scientific methods. But their explanations weren't simply primitive attempts at science. Instead, they were comprehensive worldviews that provided meaning, purpose, and guidance for daily life in ways that purely scientific explanations often cannot. These ancient beliefs also shared a common emphasis on the importance of proper relationships between humans and gods, between individuals and communities, between the living and the dead, and between human society and the natural world. While the specific requirements for maintaining these relationships varied enormously from culture to culture, the underlying recognition that humans exist within networks of obligation and interdependence was remarkably consistent across different civilizations and time periods. Many of these belief systems also included sophisticated understandings of psychology and human behavior, even though they expressed these insights in mythological or religious terms rather than scientific language. Ancient practices like meditation, divination, and various forms of therapy were often quite effective at helping people manage stress, make difficult decisions, and maintain mental health, even when the theoretical explanations for why these practices worked were completely different from modern psychological theories. The persistence and influence of these ancient beliefs is also remarkable. Many concepts that originated thousands of years ago continue to influence modern cultures, sometimes in obvious ways and sometimes in subtle patterns of thought and behavior that people aren't even aware of. Our contemporary ideas about individual responsibility, social justice, the relationship between mind and body, and the proper role of government all have roots that extend back to these ancient worldviews. What's perhaps most striking about these ancient belief systems is how seriously people took them and how completely they integrated them into every aspect of daily life. These weren't just abstract philosophical ideas or weekend religious activities, but practical guides for making decisions, organizing societies, and understanding personal identity and purpose. The ancient Egyptians really did spend enormous resources on pyramid construction because they genuinely believed it was necessary for the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife. The Greeks really did consult oracles before making major political decisions because they genuinely believed the gods would provide useful guidance. This level of commitment and integration is difficult for modern people to understand because we live in societies where religious beliefs are often separated from practical decision-making and where scientific explanations for natural phenomena have replaced many of the functions that religious beliefs once served. But for ancient people, there was no separation between spiritual and practical concerns. Every decision had both material and spiritual dimensions that had to be considered together. The study of these ancient belief systems also reveals how creative and imaginative human beings can be when trying to understand their place in the universe and their relationships with each other. While we might consider some of these beliefs strange or incorrect, they represent sophisticated attempts to create meaningful lives within the constraints and opportunities that different environments and historical periods provided. These ancient cultures developed elaborate artistic traditions, architectural achievements, and social institutions that were all expressions of their core beliefs about the nature of reality and human purpose. The pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Greece, the stone circles of Celtic Europe, and the astronomical observatories of Maya cities weren't just impressive technical accomplishments, but were physical manifestations of deeply held convictions about what mattered most in human existence. Modern archaeological and anthropological research continues to reveal new details about how these ancient belief systems functioned in practice and how they influenced the development of human civilization. Recent discoveries often challenge our previous assumptions about ancient cultures and reveal levels of sophistication and complexity that earlier scholars didn't recognize or fully appreciate. At the same time, studying these ancient beliefs can help us understand our own contemporary worldviews more clearly by showing us how different it's possible for human societies to be while still addressing the same basic questions about meaning, purpose, morality, and human relationships. The diversity of solutions that different cultures developed for similar problems demonstrates both the flexibility of human nature and the importance of cultural context in shaping individual and collective behavior. As we conclude this exploration of strange beliefs of ancient cultures, it's important to recognize that calling these beliefs strange says as much about our contemporary perspectives as it does about ancient practices. What seems bizarre or irrational to us made perfect sense to people living in different circumstances, with different information and different cultural frameworks for understanding the world. These ancient belief systems represent humanity's earliest attempts to create order, meaning, and purpose in what could otherwise seem like a chaotic and incomprehensible universe. While their specific explanations for natural phenomena and human nature have been replaced by scientific understanding, their deeper concerns about how to live well, how to maintain just societies, and how to find meaning in existence remain relevant today. The legacy of these ancient beliefs continues to influence modern cultures in countless ways, from architectural styles and artistic traditions to legal systems and ethical frameworks. Understanding where our contemporary ideas came from and how they developed through thousands of years of human experimentation with different ways of organizing society and understanding reality can help us make more informed decisions about how to address current challenges and opportunities. Perhaps most importantly, studying these ancient worldviews can help us develop greater appreciation for the complexity and creativity of human culture, and greater humility about our own contemporary assumptions and beliefs. Just as future generations may look back on some of our current ideas as strange or primitive, we can recognize that the ancient people we've discussed tonight were doing their best to understand their world and create meaningful lives with the tools and knowledge available to them. Their efforts produced civilizations that lasted for centuries or millennia, created artistic and intellectual achievements that we still admire today, and developed insights about human nature and social organization that continue to be relevant. While we may not share their specific beliefs about gods, spirits, and cosmic forces, we can appreciate their dedication to creating comprehensive worldviews that addressed both practical and spiritual needs, and their commitment to building societies based on their deepest convictions about what mattered most in human existence. In closing, our journey through the strange beliefs of ancient cultures reveals not just historical curiosities, but fundamental aspects of what it means to be human. Our need for meaning and purpose, our desire to understand our place in the universe, and our capacity for creating complex systems of thought and behavior that allow us to live together in organized societies. These ancient peoples faced the same basic challenges we face today, and while their solutions were often very different from ours, their efforts to address these challenges with creativity, dedication, and hope remain inspiring examples of human potential and resilience. As we turn off the lights on this exploration of our fascinating past, we can carry forward both knowledge of where we came from and appreciation for the ongoing human journey of discovery and understanding. Good night.